Welcome to Talmudic Treasures. Today we're in Nedarim, page 84, which discusses a situation where a person makes a purchase of grain, and this is a person, the one who sold this food, is questionable in their religious observance, specifically when it comes to the separation of tithing. This is something which is extremely important to know before a person is allowed to eat food. Before one eats food, you have to make sure all of the tithes have been removed, or it's considered to be tevel, to the extent that it's a very serious punishment for someone that would eat such food. Of course, nowadays, these laws still do apply in Israel, and therefore, in addition to knowing that food is kosher in general, you also have to make sure to know that the food's been tithed. Now, since this person is questionable whether or not he would separate certain things, it's considered to be damai, namely, what is it? And because of that, we will require you to separate again, or perhaps the first time. Now, there are so many things that need to be separated, and the question is, do they actually need to be given to the same people in the event that it was actually your grain to begin with? So every year in the 7 years, which there's a cycle that on the 7th year, which is called the sabbatical or the Shemitah, the land remains fallow. One is not allowed to plant or harvest. All the produce is considered to be ownerless, that anyone can come and take. So during the other 6 years, there's something called Meiser Ani. 10% of your produce is given to a Levi. Now, in this situation, you do have to separate it, but because there is the possibility that it was already separated from this other guy, so you don't actually have to give it to the Levi, because it's possible, again, it was already separated, and if any Levi comes, you can say, prove to me that, in fact, this first person never separated it, so this way you're entitled to it. And because there's no way he could prove it, so you get to basically keep the produce yourself. It just has to be separated. Now, there's another 10%, which depends on the year. In years 1, 2, 4, and 5, we have what's called Meiser Sheni, in which you separate 10% and that produce is brought to Jerusalem and eaten there. You could eat it. And then years 3 and 6, instead of that, we give to the poor. Now, it's interesting that the Talmud here tells us that it's possible that this guy, even though he is very stingy and may not very well like separating all of this from his grain, a person will still separate this 10% for the poor. And he says it's because he could devise an interesting strategy. All he needs to do is make himself poor, even for a few moments. You could legally say everything that you own is ownerless, which therefore now makes you completely poor. And then you could take the tithe, the 10%, and then technically, like any other person, you can just quickly reclaim all the things that you made ownerless. And therefore you'll have all the possessions you had originally. And now you get to keep the money, which is really allotted for the poor. Now, not everyone holds like that. Some people say that these guys will not go so far as to do this, especially that when it becomes ownerless, if it's truly ownerless, even for a few seconds, anyone could grab it. And since anyone can grab all of your possessions, no one's going to put all their things in such jeopardy and such a risk. Now, we therefore do see that, unfortunately, the possibility that people will take various loopholes in order to be able to get around having to give to the poor. We find this also, unfortunately, nowadays. A lot of people may not very well be very honest when it comes to tax season, and they end up claiming much less than they make. Now, not saying that revenue to a government is necessarily the same thing, but again, we see that we find people that are not so generous and even cutting corners when it comes to giving to the poor. Certainly, there is a special mitzvah to give charity, and a person should never cut corners by doing so.